Can urbanization be bad? And is modernity making people happy? These are two questions I'll take you through in this video through 5 different sections and finally ending with the conclusion of whether or not the issues I'm going to discuss in this video actually constitute a crisis. Today we'll be talking about the effects of urbanization on the human psychology and society at large, as well as taking a look at the status quo of the average state of the mental illness of humans in the modern age. So to start, I would like to go over a general description of what technology has brought in modern society and also how urbanization has been a benefit economically and technologically. So we've talked a lot about in this channel, refer to episode 2, The New Progress, about how technology has had tremendously good effects, especially in the sectors of medicine and such. One of the biggest factors I always bring up is the infant mortality rate, which is one of the biggest signs or indications of a healthy society's medicine, right? In the past, back in pre-industrial eras, it was not uncommon for a majority of a family's children to die before hitting adulthood, and many more died in infancy. And this constituted a big problem as it was an effective cutting out of a large percentage of the world population, right? If a third of your children die, that's at least a third gone, if not more, from the potential world population. So that, in addition to all the other medical advances made, helped urbanization happen because there's more people to go around, which also means that more likelihood of people moving, more immigrants, all that and such. So here we have a graph here, and if you can't see this, it's simply a graph of India, Brazil, United States, France, United Kingdom, and Sweden, and their infant mortality rates starting from the 1750s, at least with Sweden, and then showing how for each of these countries, their infant mortality rate dropped significantly throughout the course of their history. And what this shows is that there's obvious benefits, especially to population. So not only are children prevented from dying early, the medicine we've developed, vaccines, even just health in general, right? Elimination of waste in a lot of situations, sanitation. This has prolonged the human life, meaning that there's more people at higher ages. We've talked in the overpopulation video about why this is bad, and I highly do encourage you to check that out. But this just ultimately says there's a higher population, and these populations are more likely to urbanize because that's where all of these, technology, the cultural centers are, and that's where the commerce is, especially for younger people. Right? You'll find that as a general trend, the older you get, the more likely you are to move out to more rural areas. So, but given this, there needs to be a sort of weighing of whether or not these technologies are actually beneficial. This would be through either the lens of whether or not these technologies have adverse effects, or if they are produced using, for example, child labor, or if they're not sustainable, or if perhaps these technologies influence us in ways that aren't good. So we've talked a lot about how prosperity might damage us in the long run, right? We think social media, for example, I just made a hit piece on social media just a few videos ago, but we think it's such a good thing, but it's very clear that there's going to be long-term psychological effects that we won't even see fully mature until the people who grew up with social media and made it a part of their internalized character grow up to that age where it can start affecting them. So if the short-term effects are bad, surely the long-term ones are as well, is the idea we're going off of here. And off that, train of thought with social media, let's go into section 3, mental illness, or just social psychology in general. Now, I don't claim to be an expert, but based on looking at the numbers, it's very clear that this generation of people, and just in America in general, has the most mental illness, whether it be anxiety, depression, or anything else, right? And than any other generation comparably in history. I'm not going to count PTSD as that's a more, I wouldn't say lived, but directly caused, like external influence. But there's a lot of stuff being done internally, right? The introspection, the introspectiveness of society is it's clearly being seen with the rate of mental illness now. I believe it's like 20 to 30% of Generation Z at the very least, and this number varies depending on the generation, right? For example, middle-aged men in Russia, for example, just care for an example, have the highest suicide rates by far in that country, right? So it affects any group at any rate, depending on where you go and what metrics you look at. So let's take a look at some numbers here. This is the suicide rate per 100,000 people from the CDC in 2022. Keep in mind, this is around at the peak of the COVID pandemic, and you can see here there's a brief dip at the beginning of 2020, and we don't know whether that's because of the pandemic itself or because of lack of statistics, but we see that there's a big increase in young people committing suicide. It's a jump. It was always going up, of course, since 2007, but this level of jump is simply unprecedented. And it isn't only because of the economy. At the beginning of this graph, you can see that during 2008 to 2009, that the youth suicide rate actually went down while the middle-aged went up. So clearly, there's not a direct correlation between bad economy and such. So, based on this, we can see that there's more general unhappiness. There's a current loneliness epidemic that was mentioned by, I believe, the Surgeon General. There's a higher suicide rate. There's a more divorce rate, more unstable families, higher marriage ages, right? People aren't finding partners as easily. There's more apathy, depression, and all this is for a reason. And this reason isn't just because, people are weaker or even just because of social media, but there's a multitude of reasons that go into this. And I'll get into in section 4, Rat Utopia, how human psychology might have a part in this and how mice are used as a corollary. But the ultimate idea is that the situations that humans find themselves in right now, right? We hear all these things about how our brains designed for finding berries are now consuming thousands and thousands of, billions of bits of information, and how this might be changing us, how urbanization is changing us, right? So much exposure, and how, indeed, social media is changing us. And we'll get into all this shortly. So first, before we get into the actual analysis, I want to give you the details of the experiment, Rat Utopia by John Calhoun, and what this was, the context of it, So during the 1950s and 60s, this was after World War II, when the American economy especially began to recover, along with even Germany and Japan, right? And what this saw was an unprecedented level of human growth. This is when technological advancements due to the world wars were fully being realized. The strong economies, more social services, all of these things allowed for a higher birth rate, leading a lot of people to be fearful of overpopulation. There was fears of mass starvation because we didn't have enough food to feed people. Of course, this isn't really a problem anymore, but this was a serious concern back in the day. If you can recall media pieces like Soylent Green, which foretold a future where humans were blended up into, food because there were just so many people, there was a genuine, aura of, or a tendency of media and people at the time to be fearful of such. And thus became the Rat Utopia experiment. In 2 different experiments ranging between the 1960s and 70s, and spanning 5 years at a time, I believe, Calhoun experimented with mice and rats to find out how their social systems were changed when their populations increased at a similar or relative rate to humans, and when they were urbanized in ways that rat society wasn't supposed to be. So you might be thinking, oh, what rats? They don't have society, right? They're rats. They can't do X, Y, or Z. But they do. Mice and rats, right? They've been proven to be highly social creatures and more intelligent than we think, capable of certain problem solving, and to a certain degree, they have, a sense of planning, right? Mice are always, sort of, in at least folklore, made to represent the shrewd, maybe a little bit sneaky kind of character. And this is true because mice do have some sort of that quality. And therefore, even though we're not exactly humans, there's a lot we share. And to that point, all mammalian brains share similar brain makeup, at least when it comes to our base instincts, our base desires. And the only thing that makes humans different is our prefrontal cortex, the one that lets us plan really deeply, makes us make decisions, makes us go against our internal mammalian desires, like whatever it may be, right? It allows us to go against our more animalistic desires, and that's what makes a human special. Yet there's things that we can't feel happening that always happen subconsciously, right? That we don't know is happening, but is a part of our evolutionary psychology fundamentally because it's important to such. For example, I read a study on this a while back. I can, if you can confirm whether or not this is true, that would be great in the comment section down below, which has been great recently. But I heard somewhere that when human societies, the average rate of marriage goes higher. There's a higher chance, or there's been a trend of revolution because it's too hard to procreate. and men who are more likely to be revolutionaries in their 20s, 30s to 40s even would initiate something like that to make the mating pool better. I don't know if that's true or not, but I did see that somewhere, and that would support what I'm saying here. But ultimately, the point is that rice, rats and mice, and humans still have the same basic instincts. So based on this, let's go into the Rat Utopia experiment. So starting with, I believe 9 mice, they get in a certain housing space made for 6,000. This is important. They gave them infinite food, no predators, no disease, water, right, shelter, all of these things that were great, and they let them breed for a certain set of days, right? And what happened is, as you would expect, with these ideal conditions for population growth, these post-scarcity environment, the population grew hugely, up to around 2,000 every time, and after which it tapered off and it began to round out, and as the population, the birth rate started to slow down, as we are seeing today. Again, I highly recommend my overpopulation versus underpopulation video if you want to learn more about this. But what happened is, after that point, what happened is that there was a certain psychological switch that seemed to form within a lot of these mice. Keep in mind, these areas were designed for 6,000 mice. There could have been more, right? There could have been more, but it stopped at 2,000, and that's very strange, at about 500 days. So mice society does exist, as we said, and what happened after this point is that mice society started to collapse via a multitude of points. I'll go through some of them here. Number one, female mice became more aggressive and were often had less pregnancies, terminated them even in some cases, and were not actually able to raise their young properly. Meanwhile, a certain division of male mice became more meek and were obsessed with grooming themselves. Additionally, among males, there became a leveling off of alpha versus the other males, which is basically that there would be male mice who would basically form harems. They would be the quote-unquote alphas as we talk about today, even though if that's not the most accurate term, and they would also go around in packs and try to rape other mice, whether or not it's female or male. And we saw that, and there's also increased violence onto children from both females and males. Additionally, certain bands of mice that weren't on the very top or on the very bottom would go around and start to hunt down, even cannibalize other mice who weren't able to, who were doing, who were reproducing, who were trying to survive, and they would prevent the productive ones from actually being productive. Meanwhile, there was another group called the Beautiful Ones, as dubbed by Calhoun, who were mice who survived the chaos, but didn't do anything except for take care of themselves, right? Make sure their fur's all nice, drinking water, eating, and they served no purpose. They had zero interest in socializing with other mice. They had zero interest in reproducing, and these all seem like things that go against our base, evolutionary psychology, right? How could these mammals, right, these mice, go against evolutionary psychology and not want to reproduce? And that's because of the social situations caused by this mass urbanization and this higher population that's introduced so rapidly, right? You have these, you have less involvement with your children. You have a difference in a strong difference between the top rank of males and bottom rank. You have more independent or aggressive female mice, right? All things that aren't, of course, one-to-one translations, but trends we see today. Testosterone levels, etc. All of these are falling in men right now. Meanwhile, you're seeing a lot of this sort of, at least in the contemporary culture, this sort of alpha male backlash, right? You're seeing these people who, you may have heard of figures like Andrew Tate, who are unpopularly, but still somehow having this huge following off of this quote-unquote alpha pimp mentality. So this shows that there is this sort of up and down thing of like people who submit to the system and people who try to subvert it. Whether or not I agree with it, it's a trend that can't be ignored, right? And ultimately, what ends up happening is that the population ends up crashing in these little mice societies. After they stopped breeding in these dense centers, you have all these cannibalism, gang fighting, violence, right? Mice uninterested in doing anything, and this results in the collapse of these mice society at about 500 days after this experiment first started, according to the averages, depending on as an average of the different experiments. So what does this say? What does this reflect about not only the nature of urbanization, but how it affects our psychology? I'm not a psychologist myself, so I can only guess, but I can talk more about urbanization and the effects it might have on individuals. And one of the biggest things that I find interesting about the Mice Utopia isn't urbanization. It's a lot about abundance, right? Are we a post-scarcity society? And we may not think so. Oh, there's poor people out there. There's, XYZ, but there is very little work, even in America, even if you are of a poor stature, you're not farming your own food. You're not, going out and hunting unless you have that ability or even opportunity, right? Food, all of these things, even like, how do I say this? But we are, to a certain degree, post-scarcity because there's simply so much out there, at least in America. We're focusing on America here because it's one of the most urbanized nations in the world, right? And you can, of course, draw a corollary to this to the entirety of Europe, Western Europe. Anyways, given this, the combination of abundance and urbanization is really weird because it creates a situation where you have a lot of people, or mice, but you also have no incentive to work towards a social good or a common good because you have so much abundance. And therefore, there is infinite power and infinite comfort without the level of responsibility that such things normally confer to you, right? If you want to have all these good things, normally you would have to have a job. You need to work hard. You need to take care of your family, of the lot of people around you, right? But these urban and abundant populations don't have this pressure. And what this does is it changes the social norms to be different at the very least. I'm not going to say worse or better because we have to see the final results, but this changes social norms in urban populations very deeply. And urbanization is only speeding up, right? I meant to show this earlier, but this is an example of the Mice Utopia. And the share of populations living in urbanized areas is increasing at a seemingly exponential rate. And with the most powerful policymakers in the world, like the Klaus Schwab with the World Economic Forum, saying in urbanization is the best way out of certain situations, and urban cities should be the future. So so we can have more control and centralized stuff, which conspiracy or not is definitely something that you might want to consider. WEF wants everyone in the same place, but yeah, whatever. But what that does is it creates more and more situations where similar human psychology moments like Rat Utopia can be replicated in human psychology. Again, rats and mice and humans are not the same at all, right? Even rats and mice. However, what we saw was extremely, how do I say, provocative because of what it might suggest about what happens when humans urbanize to such a strong degree that even if we don't fill up all the space that's left on the earth, that there's just going to be serious stuff like mental illness, like people, males becoming more meek, like female mice becoming more aggressive, like our children not being raised properly due to these circumstances, right? And this sounds dystopian, and the mice societies fell apart every time. That's the thread. It's like the unifying thread. But let's go into final section 5. Are we screwed? The answer is no. So you might, I'm a big doom guy on this channel apparently, but while abundance and urbanization might be our downfall, we have the unique capacity to actually prevent it. We've talked multiple times in this video about how we're, really similar to mice, and we have the same, instinctual evolutionary psychology, right? Mammalian psychology that might cause, that doesn't prepare us for situations like abundance and urbanization, right? Of so many people who you don't know, who you're not necessarily cooperating with, and a post-scarcity society where you don't actually have to rely so heavily on yourself, right? Of course, there's, you need to still work a job or at the very least do other stuff, but there's so much out there that going hungry as long as you have the resources is impossible. As long as you work, you will not go hungry, at least in a stable economic time. Anyways, these situations are similar to the mice, right? You have so much stuff, the normal social norms that make us human and make mice are broken down. And a big question is, will we know this is happening? If we are in this behavioral sink cycle, as Calhoun called it, which is all this stuff, just like going down the drain and all these social norms getting thrown down the drain, if this is happening, will we know it? Because if it is happening, it'll be in each of us. We'll each have a different part of the rat utopia experiment as part of us, whether us be the omega or the beta or the alpha or the beautiful ones, whatever it may be. We all carry a part of this. So will we know if rat utopia and the behavioral sink is falling upon us? That's one of the big questions I wanted to pose, because this applies not only to this theory, but so many things else, right? A lot of people think that, decadence is upon us and a civilizational fall is upon us. But at which point does that become clear to us, to the point where we can do something? And that's the difficult part, because we have the ability, we have the unique ability among animals to change things and just manipulate society in a way that will actually be beneficial for us. We're not mice. We're not rats. We're humans who can think for ourselves, and we can transcend our, basic psychological beliefs that make us mentally ill in these situations, that makes us more depressed, more unlikely to mate, that to all of these things that we've sort of done to ourselves because of urbanization, but we also have the equal ability to go back, to change things, to make it right, to fix it in ways that actually make reality conducive to human growth in a positive light. Whether this means we go to more rural areas, or we find ways to make it more bearable to live in urbanized areas, right? Human adaptation is impressive, and that's what we have to rely on. So, let me know what you thought about this video. If you're a loyal viewer, you'll find that this is a almost one-to-one redo of episode 10. However, that video did not get as much traction as I want, despite it being one of my more, passionate videos. So let me know what you think. If you have any comments, criticisms, critiques, make sure you watch the videos I recommended in this video to get a full understanding of this topic. Thank you, and it's been the Rhetoric Reviewed. Out.